Hello and welcome to History Hacks dedicated Second World War air power podcast Hedge Hopping with me, Matt Bone. We've got an exciting episode for you today because we're heading east and west at the same time. We're going to be talking about the Ilyushin IL-2, the Shturmovik, the flying tank of the Eastern Front. Renowned for its armored protection and massive punch, the IL-2 was a vital cog in both the Red Army and Red Navy's push to Berlin. Tens of thousands of them were built, and the Shturmovik's legend is such today that flight sims are built around it, and she regularly tops people's top 10 lists of World War aircraft. But today we are going to be talking about an IL-2M in particular, whose new home is in the furnace that is the Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona. And to chat about it, I'm delighted to welcome Scott Marchand, who's the executive director of the museum and joins us now. And like me, is a Calgary boy in exile.
Hey Matt, nice to join you, and appreciate coming on board. And yeah, it's a funny small world. Born and raised in Calgary, and tromped around the world, and did some school in St Andrews, and then a couple jobs, and wound up down here about 20 years ago. At a much lower level in the organization, and then been able to work my way to the top. And it's been a fabulous journey, and I couldn't imagine having landed in a better place to cultivate a professional career. It's every day is fresh and different, and of course I get to do exciting and mentally challenging things like this.
Well, we'll try not to challenge you too much. Let's start by talking about the sort of history of the aircraft itself, and then we'll talk about the museum's
Sure.
IL-2 and the museum as well, because besides the Shturmovik, you've got some amazing toys that I want to ask about a bit later. We're gonna start with the Russian. So the IL-2 is an interesting aircraft. What was the idea behind it, and when did she come about?
Yeah, well, so it's similar to the West. The Russians were experimenting with all sorts of aircraft designs, doctrinal concepts. There's a lot of high-minded thinking about aerial warfighting going on in the Soviet Union, in much the way it was in the West, evolving new tactics, doctrines, and trying to figure out ways and means of adapting and using the technology that the aircraft designers and engineers were coming up with. The Russians, or the Soviets, the Russians started working on the sort of omnibus notion of a ground attack aircraft as early as 1932. And over the course of that period from 1932 to 1939, there were about 24 independent designs for ground attack aircraft being generated by various Soviet design bureaus, aircraft factories, the Russian Air Force. And the impetus for that need really was pushed and driven by Russian pilots who were returning from the Spanish Civil War, who had been, of course, flying against the fascist forces, and they, the little Radas had been involved with, ground support and whatnot, and found them, woefully inadequate for the task, as the Radas were for most anything. So that pushed things along, and in the February of 1938, Sergei Ilyushin, who at the time was the head of design at factory number 39, he proposed to the Soviet military leadership the need for a quote-unquote a flying tank, right, sort of in response to these conversations he had with returning Russian pilots from Spain. And he very optimistically represented that he could have it ready for acceptance trials by November. So after a little bit of going back and forth, in early May, the proposition was approved, and the Air Force Development Ministry instructed him to develop 3 different designs using the same engine, right? So they were asking for 3 prototypes designed to meet certain combat and operational specifications. And they started off with the AM-34 engine, which was made by the McCoolin company. So it basically, Soviet aircraft nomenclature and the design bureaus and the equipment is pretty pretty chaotic at times. I mean, it makes sense in some ways, but it makes the U.S. Navy look sensible in the way they've. The Russian engine. So the Mikulin is noted by the AM designation, and the number is basically the evolutionary sequence of the engine, the 34 series, up to the 35, onto the 36, 37, 30, so forth, right? And there'd be suffixes appended to the engine types depending on accessories. Was it a high altitude engine, low altitude engine, boosted, supercharged, or various things like that. So the initial design concept that this competition was designated the BSH AM34FRN, and the engine was shortly after substituted to the 35 series engine. So what the Russian Air Force was looking for was a fully enclosed, heavily armored, dedicated ground attack aircraft. So the initial series of engines actually had been supercharged, and their performance was optimized for high altitude. So they were really kind of deficient. So they very shortly substituted for an unsupercharged engine. It was generating about 1,300 horsepower. So the first prototype, this BSH-2, right out the gate, it underperformed in almost all objective parameters that had been laid out for it. So the Russian Air Force, the Soviet Air Force, demanded that modifications be made to this prototype so it met the design specifications, and sort of coincidentally, independently, or collectively, and it's not really clear from the records, the Air Force and Ilyushin both decided to delete the rear gunner's cockpit. So the Shturmovik prototype was originally designed as a fully enclosed, fully armored two crew cockpit. So that was basically deleted to cut weight, work with the center of gravity, engine performance, acceleration. Because one of the doctrines at the time was this idea that it was going to be a really fast aircraft and that it would be relatively invulnerable to fighter attack. It could sort of get its way in and out of a fight. The presumption with the Soviets was that they wouldn't be subjected to rear or above attacks by fighters. So, very, very optimistic. So what they did is they deleted that position and they instituted an engine change in the Mikulin 38 series engine, which had 400 more horsepower. So we're getting the 1,700 horsepower range, which allowed them to get everything sort of back on track. And by mid-October, the redesign was ready for flight, and the trials began on October 2nd, 1938. A few other compounding changes were made that would continue to be made on the airplane over the course of its adoption and production and deployment. So one thing to sort of like a sideboard note here is with the Shturmovik, with a lot of the Russian aircraft, unlike in the West, where there was sort of a methodical documentation of redesign and sort of conscious backing and forth, a lot of the Russian redesign and implementation of changes was done in a much looser, more organic fashion in a response to the operational tempo, the demand of the Russian front. They didn't really have they'd modify things on the production lines. They would adapt materials available locally. We'll talk about some of the production challenges in a few minutes, but what I'm kind of getting at is there are literally volumes in Russia that are hundreds of pages long that document all of the incremental changes, all of the the dead end evolutionary sidebars, like experimentations with radial engines, all of the fussing on what sort of armament combination to settle on. So there's 3 hours worth of pedantic engineering discussion there. So I'm gonna gloss over a lot of that because it's not really pertinent to what we're doing here. In these October 38 trials, some of the changes made to the prototype that you'll see becoming very notable visual characteristics of the aircraft as it evolves. The engine was moved forward about 2 inches. There was 5 degrees of aft wing sweep, and about 3% more vertical stabilizer area was introduced. One of the big challenges that the Shturmovik faced in its genesis phase was its longitudinal stability was really shitty, and they were always working against center of gravity, like even minor changes in location of equipment and crew weight, would destabilize aircraft pretty quickly. So there was a challenge that plagued the Shturmovik well into the early parts of the war. And at this point too, the armor shell was only between 4 and 8 millimeters thick, around his hull. So I don't know, what's that in fractions? I don't know, something between, something around 9/16 of an inch or something, substantial. So at this point too, some of the really remarkable and distinctive design choices of the Shturmovik are very obvious, right? So one of the key things that the Russians did was they buried the radiator inside the fuselage, and they brought the cooling air over the top of the engine in front of the pilot and ducted it through sort of an S-curved duct down into the radiators below. And the radiators were armored; they had armored louvers that cluster under the belly of the Shturmovik was always one of its vulnerable areas, no matter how much armor they put there with the radiator and the oil pump. They were all sort of clustered in the same, let's say, half square meter of the aircraft in that area. So German anti-aircraft gunners learned pretty quickly that if you could catch a Shturmovik at a low angle banking away from you, quick squirt into the belly, roughly there was a pretty surefire way to bring them down. So as the course of these trials, the armor was increased in size to about 10 millimeters. What really sealed the fate of integrating a rear gunner at this point was there was a lot of concern for protecting the fuel and the pilot. So the main fuel tank for the Shturmovik was located right immediately behind the pilot. It was a giant, couple 100-gallon rubberized tank. So immediately behind that, they put in a 12 millimeter thick piece of armored steel, and it was right around the center of gravity for the airplane. So there wasn't really much ability to move stuff aft too easily. Now, this armored shell is really remarkable. There's a lot of tendency in the West for people to think that the Russians were crude. It's a fair criticism from the standpoint of finished aesthetics of a lot of their equipment, right? In the West, we spent a lot of time making Spitfires very elegant. The Sherman's a really attractive tank. But the Russians, they put the energy where it mattered, and they didn't worry about the cosmetics too much, right? But the Shturmovik was made out of very, very high grade steel. When we were restoring our airplane, there's a lot of we had parts of the cowl that had cracked as a consequence of its ditching on the frozen lakes. The rapid cooling of the steel resulted in cracks. So we got a pretty talented volunteer who here's a very competent welder, and so of course, to know what sort of material he needed to weld the aircraft, he needed to identify the alloys and whatnot. And of course, we didn't really have much in the way of documentation of that. So he took a fragment and a sample, and went off and did some research and some testing, and through various cognitive feats of magic, he came back and said, "Oh my God, do you have any idea what kind of material we're working with here?" I said, "Well, no, that's what you're looking up for us." He goes, "Well, let me put it this way. This is 8,000 PSI pressure steel. This is basically the same grade of steel that the U.S. built its submarine hulls during the Second World War."
Wow.
So he was pretty impressed. And, there you go. So, the Russians put a lot of, they had clever engineers, and, in a lot of cases, good enough was good enough. But this monocoque, well, no, it's not a monocoque, but this armored shell that was unique to the Shturmovik was a tricky bit of manufacturing, right? So the foundries were pressing panels out of with 100-ton punch presses and draft presses and draw presses, and then skilled welders were tasked to weld all these sections together and build it up, because it's the spar, it's there's no longerons in the airplane. Most aluminum built aircraft have this framework that cowl panels and bits and pieces are riveted to, or fastened to, and the Shturmovik's not like that. The armored cowls are the shell of the airplane. They interlock with half-turn tabs, and it goes together like a big mechano set. So it's really easy to get apart, to work on in the field, easy to assemble. But it's one great big massive thing, right?
It's quite a departure from what a Western airplane nut would be used to when it comes apart. It's essentially a submarine. It's all the structures going into the curve.
Yeah, and sort of the peripherals, like the aft fuselage and the wing panels at that time were made from wood. Until the end of the war, the fuselage continued to be made out of wood, as did the vertical stabilizer. Um, there was discussions about introducing metal fuselage kits, but by that time they were already contemplating the IL-8 and the IL-10 designs. As it screw it, we'll just wait until the next generation of aircraft come along to go all metal. The introduction of metal wings haphazardly in late 1943, increased the survivability of the airplane. It made a lot of the armaments more effective, because one of the problems with wooden wings too is, when you're launching the RS-82 or RS-132 rockets. I mean, they're not big rockets; they're sort of 2-kilogram warheads versus, Western HFARs that were 47 pounds or something, 25 kilograms. Like orders of magnitude larger. And the 23 millimeter cannons in the wings, and it still, it put a lot of stress on the wood. The wood was vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, so they were shedding wings pretty easily. The damage was severe and not easily field repaired. So they would have sets of wing panels at maintenance areas and just replace them rather than repair damage. So the metal wings increased the effectiveness of the Shturmovik, made them stronger. Combat survivability was increased. So, but it's it was constructed at the outer limits of probably the production capacity of the Russians at the time. And you see this across the armaments industry, right? They were drafting huge numbers of completely untrained and in often cases illiterate peasants into these factories to assemble fairly complex pieces of equipment under the supervision of, one or two people that could read the instructions. And they threw themselves at it with great gusto. But, when you're making concessions, if you've got a civilian population that's really handy with woodworking, those are skills you exploit, versus spending time teaching a whole bunch of people how to rivet, cut aluminum, and shape it and that kind of thing. So where it was essential to engineer and build it with craft, it was done, and where they could compromise, they did.
I think the shape of the aircraft is pretty familiar to everybody. So we're sort of looking more or less from rear of the rear gunner back is all wood.
Yes.
I bring that up because the sort of common conception of this flying tank is this is a big, all armored, all armored, all metal all the time sort of thing.
The gunners weren't particularly enthusiastic about it. And, and despite the legend, the Russians weren't, well, I mean, they were certainly proficient and certainly callous and expedient, but they did give consideration to the survivability of their crews. I mean, they'd invested time and energy in training them, and the Shturmovik gunners ultimately proved their value and their worth, with many of them becoming aces. So there was and the crews formed a real strong bond too. They flew together as regularly as possible. So there was some desire to protect them, and there were plans to try and extend the armored monocoque, but again, it introduced center of balance problems, power, you're compromising payload, fuel load, and there was a lot of concern about introducing too many significant changes, in 1943 or 44 would disrupt production. And, we'll touch on the the threat that Stalin issued about production of Shturmovik. So nobody was really, maybe this is the time to just maybe throw that in though. So, not long after the invasion and as the Germans were approaching Moscow in the fall of 1941 there, these factories were being evacuated from the area to the Urals, out of reach of the Russians, or out of reach of the Germans, sorry. And so it was a complete shambles, and they hadn't really fully refined the production techniques either. in the context of the Soviet Union at risk of being conquered by the Germans, Stalin sent a telegram to the directors of the Shturmovik production plants that basically in translation reads, "You have let down our country and our Red Army. You have the nerve not to manufacture IL-2s until now. Our Red Army now needs IL-2 aircraft like the air it breathes, like the bread it eats. Schenkman produces 1 IL-2 a day, and Tretyakov builds 1 or 2 MiG-3s a day. It's a mockery of the country and the Red Army. I ask you not to try the government's patience and demand that you manufacture more IL-2s. This is my final warning, Stalin."
That's not the letter you want to get in the post in the morning over your coffee, is it?
No, it doesn't leave any room for interpretation, right? So what they're touching on there is, and we sort of skipped forward on some of the development, but I don't know that it's that pertinent to to backtrack a bit, but at the point of the Russian, or at the point of the German invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, there were no Shturmoviks at frontline units at all, and there were actually only 18 of them in the Soviet Air Force in the field, and only 5 of them were serviceable. And they actually didn't go into service until 5 days after the invasion of Russia had begun, when a flight of 5 of them attacked a column of soft-skinned German vehicles advancing through central Russia. So it was consequential, and over those subsequent months, the Russian production capacity just wasn't there. It's hard to imagine at this stage, so we've got 18 Shturmoviks in the Air Force and only a handful of them operationally capable, that by the time the end of the war came in May of 45, 36,183 Shturmoviks had been manufactured, making it the most produced military aircraft in history. And if you roll in the IL-10 production, you're coming in just shy of 42,000 aircraft between 1941 and 1948. And this is multiplied across different aircraft types and tanks and artillery pieces and small arms. I mean, and to be fair, I mean, we did this all in the West too. Tens of thousands of Spitfires, Hurricanes. 19,000 B-24 Liberators. And this is all sort of in the same period. I mean, the total war really didn't kick into high gear until the Russian invasion and the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, bringing the Americans in 1942. So the real high intensity segment of the war was sort of late 41 through the end of 1945, and that's when the scale of industrial production across the planet just went into overheated overdrive, and it's almost impossible for us to imagine, especially in the modern era when. Well, what are we looking at? Charitably 25 years development of the F-35s, and still not a full operational wing.
Let's not talk about the F-35. That just makes everybody cross.
Let's not. Yes. So anyway, back to more cheerful topics like the Russian front.
You start looking at the numbers, especially on the Eastern Front, and 30,000 IL-2s made. You could trace the line just back to an angry telegram, couldn't you? Because you really would, knowing the boss, as they all did, you did as you were told, pretty sharpish, and having to quickly move factories back, strip out what you need, rebuild them much further back into the east, into Siberia, those sort of areas that were out of reach, and then, as you said, get people who knew sort of what they were doing and people who didn't know what they were doing to start producing these aircraft by the tens of thousands. It is a remarkable achievement, even within the slightly jaded look we may look at it from the West.
Most people who are interested in history, I mean, you get tapped into the stuff that excites you. I mean, my interest started at a very early age growing up in Calgary. I mean, as a kid in the 70s, and we're surrounded by veterans who, when I think back, are like roughly my age now, early 50s. My next door neighbor was a policeman who had gone ashore on D-Day with the Calgary Highlanders, and the guy the next row over was a Lancaster navigator, and just up and down the street, right? Everybody's uncle had, my Boy Scout leaders were, Highlanders, and it's war stories left, right, and center. And down the road from where I was growing up in Calgary was the Naval Reserve Unit. They had a Seafire and a Sea Fury parked on the grass out in front there. And when the weather was nice in the summer, the commissionaires down there would let us, go play in the cockpits and mess around in the airplanes, and it sets. But your whole focus and emphasis growing up, and especially in the Cold War era, was to really kind of dismiss what happened in the East, other than to talk about Stalingrad and Kursk and a few things like that. But having gotten older and into this job, and really sort of propelled by the IL-2, really gone fairly deeply into learning about the war in the East, and it's statistically it's mind-boggling. I mean, I'm sure even a lot of the people that you have on your podcast or that the girls talk to, don't totally comprehend the differential scales of what was going on. We're going to touch on Kursk later, so we can talk about some of that, separately. But just for one sort of comparative contextual statement, right? So at the point of the kickoff of Kursk on July 3rd, 1943, there were 10,300,000 German soldiers in the army, active army at that point. Of that number, only 2.7% were involved in active operations against the Anglo-Western Allies. And from D-Day to the fall of Germany, there were about 5 million Allied soldiers into Western Europe, and that's slightly less than what the German army and the Russians engaged at Kursk for 2 months. So it's unreal.
Looking at the conflict as a whole, the numbers never quite stack up in your head, because you can't really visualize numbers that big, even when you travel to Normandy and you see those, I said there were beautiful graveyards, but you just get a scale of 10,000 here and so, but then you have to up that again and again and again, just in the ETO, and then you go to the East, and then that number gets, you can't, we don't have a frame of reference for those sorts of numbers anymore, I don't think.
Yeah, it's really abstract. I mean, I know I'm paraphrasing, but it's going to people say, well, 1 or 2 murders is a tragedy and 1 million is a statistic, and fortunately, as time has moved on, we've become much more conscious of the value of human life and our fellow man. I mean, we're just coming out of 20 years involvement in the Middle Eastern conflict, and the casualty figures, for that 20 years, in some cases, don't even reflect a day or two's operation on the Western Front in World War I, or a quiet day in Russia would see more casualties. Another number that's been thrown around this year, just sort of give it some context, is, in the United States here, there's been over 600,000 deaths attributed to COVID-19. That is more than the total wartime dead that the entire United States has suffered since 1776. We quite rightly recognize and revere and remember, the people that put down their lives for the country, but I don't know, we don't seem to have the same reverence for each other.
There's a perspective issue there, which is terrifying and interesting all at the same time.
Yeah, there really is. Anyway, so on with
let's get back to the planes.
On with the show. Yeah.
I guess from sort of 1942, we're really starting to see the aircraft coming into its own, being produced in numbers, being delivered to frontline units in numbers. Yeah. We're going to start probably focusing on the M variant, because that's the one you guys have. So what has been done since those early production ones to what is really the sort of the most known, perhaps, of the variant?
So the most known, the most typical example of the Shturmovik in 1943 would be the swept wing version. It's called an arrow wing, because it's got an aft sweep to the outer wing panels to increase longitudinal stability. Armament's been settled into 2 23 millimeter cannons in the wings. as well as two 7.62 millimeter machine guns in the wings, combinations of rocket rails on the wings in either 2 or 4 combinations for RS-82 and RS-132 rockets. The bombs were carried in an internal panel in the wing root with breakaway doors very similar to the Bristol Blenheim. They're wooden doors that were spring trap loaded, and the bombs just sort of dropped through the door. The bombs knocked the door out of the way, the springs closed the door, and on you went. Shturmoviks carried about 400 kilograms of bombs on missions, and they were lightweight bombs, 25 kilogram, 50 kilogram. They were fragmentation bombs, phosphorus bombs, armor penetrating bombs. I mean, the rear gunner, they had settled on the Berezin UBT heavy machine gun, which is roughly equivalent to the Western Browning M2 50 caliber. Slightly shorter round, a little less ballistic punch, but still really, really pretty effective. So that's largely speaking what the vast majority of the Soviet crews took into battle with them. And all of this was focused towards ground attack. You know, the rear gunner was defensive, but he was also eyes and ears and lookouts. They coordinated things. But the Russians also had they evolved very sophisticated and effective tactics with respect to ground attack. So, you know, the air war in the East was very different from the air war in the West, which was done largely at high altitude or at night, high energy. You know, in the East, it was largely, you know, it was World War I style aerial fighting with modern machines. You know, most of the fighting was heavily focused over the front. The objective was reconnaissance, nuisance interdiction, and fighters were largely used to prevent reconnaissance and interdiction. So, you know, most Shturmovik operations never penetrated more than about 6 miles or 10 kilometers past the front lines. You know, they initially started off with small groups of 3 aircraft in a sort of an flight element with 3 elements in an attack formation. Very quickly, they added extra aircraft, so 4, 8, and 12. You know, very comparable to the West and to the German tactics. You know, they would brief objectives. They would assign different roles to the different aircraft, but they also had this sort of interesting view that, okay, if the objective was achieved with 1 or 2 aircraft, everybody else went free for all. Nobody came home with ammunition, and the expectation was to kill Germans. To protect themselves and to, you know, surprise their adversaries. Initially, the Shturmovik operations were very low level. You know, under 500 feet, they would head out. But, you know, what was complicating there is, you know, from the prairies, you know, there's a pretty bleak sameness to it, right? There's very few landmarks, and when you're low down, you really lack perspective. And, you know, most of the Russian steppe areas, and certainly, you know, the northern parts of the boreal forests are like that too. So they ended up actually using Pathfinder aircraft, usually SBs or PE-2s, would fly at a higher altitude and communicate with the formation leaders and sort of walk them into the target area. And then when they were sort of lined up on whether it be field guns, columns, troop concentrations, you have it, you know, that sort of release the Shturmoviks and say, okay, you know, this compass heading, off you go. And they would do what was initially called like a zoom and climb attack, where they would, you know, come from 500 feet up to, say, 3,000 or 4,000 feet, tip over into a fairly steep dive, select their targets, conduct their attacks. If they still had ammunition, they'd come around and do it again. The Shturmovik crews never came from the target with more than 1 aircraft the same direction. So part of their zooming, you know, their attack strategy was everybody to sort of scatter and come from different directions. So you were sort of the opposite of a herd defense. This was the opposite of whatever herd defense is. You know, so you would have so many random targets in random places that you'd hopefully make yourself less likely to be targeted by ground fire, because when there's all stuff swirling around, you know, who do you task for target when you're the ground guy? And, you know, later on they evolved, you know, different tactics, you know, the famous circle of death. They had, you know, the S-turns, and they had scissor attacks. I mean, the scissor attacks were interesting because you'd have a pair of aircraft come in and they'd line up their target, and then they would basically weave back and forth and then circle themselves in. They would they would release their munitions at the outer arc and ellipse of the attack. and then they would sort of sweep in, and at some point somebody would be vulnerable from an inline friendly fire attack. So they got pretty confident with those type of things. They would do like weaving S attacks, where formation like 4 aircraft, a leader would go in and he would start weaving an S down onto and hitting targets on the way down, and then the following 3 aircraft would fall into the same formation. Famous Wheel of Death was really as much a defensive, very similar to a Luftberry circle, right? I mean, you'd have the element of aircraft would fly into, not even so much a circle, it was more of an ellipse, right? But they would get into this sort of circular formation over the targets, and that would allow the aircraft behind to cover the aircraft in front. And in order, they would drop off. Number 1 would drop out of the circle down to lower level, attack his targets, come up, join the circle. The next one would come down, drop, and attack, and so forth. And they became very effective at it. The attrition rate was high with Shturmoviks. I mean, 50% of the combat losses were to fighters, and 50% were to ground, the ground attack, and that includes, missing and undetermined. I mean, plenty of them never came back, but it's pretty easy to to fill in the blanks. That they were probably hit by ground fire, or they got intercepted by fighters. Now, confirming which it was, who knows? But the loss and attrition rates were high. But the Russians were not completely. Well, they valued their comradeship, right? I mean, comrade, right?
We have this image of them being quite callous because of the numbers,
Yeah.
but you spent a lot of time training these people and building up a unit.
Yeah.
You don't want that unit to be constantly replenished with newbies.
No, and then you're all in this fight together as Soviet citizens, right? So, I mean, one thing that was interesting that I'd come across a little while ago while I was reading is that it wasn't so much a standing order, but it was a standing practice that whenever practical, Shturmovik crews would rescue each other. So there's sort of a few famous Western incidents where somebody would land their fighter, and the guy on the ground would climb in under that take off in the Spitfire or whatever, and then get out of there. But this was actually fairly common practice with the Shturmovik crews. They would, if a crew went down and they were clearly alive and the Germans weren't too far away, and the field or roads nearby were worth taking a chance on, somebody in the element would land while the rest of them flew top cover, and they'd rescue the crews. They'd scramble in and take off. And several guys won Hero of the Soviet Union medals for these type of things. One time, one guy took off with like 4 extra crewmen crammed into their Shturmovik, and one guy basically hanging off the wing on, clutching through the cockpit. The Hero of the Soviet Union was roughly equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor or the Victoria Cross. There were about 2,700 and change awarded during the war. 800 and some of these were awarded to Air Force attack crews. So either, largely Shturmovik pilots, but PE2 and people who did ground attack, another 800 odd to fighter pilots, and another, the balance to tankers and infantrymen. So, there was a real esprit de corps. I mean, these were pretty dedicated people.
The one that usually pops to mind is Anna Yergova, isn't it? She got 270 odd missions she flew before she was captured. I guess we would call it a cosmopolitan bunch, because it wasn't a certain strata of society that would go into the Air Force like it is in the West. You kind of know the type that would end up in aircraft, whereas in the Red Army it was very much aptitude based and reasonably gender blind, not completely, but far more so than we had here.
Yeah, I mean, it was a large function of expediency and necessity too. I mean, any able body that could fight, farm, or work in a factory was pressed into that service. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of recent famous discussion of the Russian the Night Witches, the dedicated female units, but the female aircrew were quite reasonably represented across the Soviet Air Force in this period. I mean, not in high numbers, but it wasn't uncommon for replacement pilots to come into a random fighter unit. There'd be a couple of women involved. There were several very famous female Shturmovik crews. There were plenty of mixed crews where there'd be female pilots, male gunners, female pilots, male gunners. They experienced quite a bit of success. So it was you know, in many respects, that wartime experience of the Russians, the egalitarianism of the Russians, and to some extent, it was sort of thumbing at the West culturally too. I mean, let's face it, there's plenty of sexism to go around in Russia, and plenty of social stratigraphy. But but women got a real taste of combat in that era that hadn't really been well known in the West until comparatively recently. I mean, several aces, lots, yeah.
There's lots of fascinating stories there from that, but I think that's another podcast, because we have to move along, and we can't talk about this aircraft without mentioning Operation Scissor Attacks, of course, the famous battle at Kursk, which has been fascinating over the last few years with a lot of the reassessment, the aerial photography of it, and being a Typhoon guy myself, knowing that a claim from the air is very different to an actual claim on the ground. But the air component of this insanely big battle is absolutely fascinating, because again, it's mind-boggling numbers, but then it's just constant air cover going into that salient, which was literally hell on earth, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean that. Again, that battle kind of boggles the mind. I have these still in my possession from the 70s, Purnell's History of the War and Weekly Digest, and they're really quite superb because a lot of them were written by people involved at the time in the 70s. So the Kursk issue here was written by a Russian tank general who was involved in the battle. But so to give you some idea of the lineup of the battle, so the Kursk was July 3rd until the end of August 43, and it committed. Well, the lineup for the battle, the Wehrmacht had 900,000 soldiers. The Red Army had 1.3 million. The Germans had 10,000 artillery pieces. The Red Army had 20,000. The Germans had 2,700 tanks and assault guns. The Russians had 3,600 tanks and assault guns. The Luftwaffe was fielding 2,000 aircraft. The VVS was fielding 2,400 aircraft. So of that 2,400, fully a quarter were Shturmoviks, and they undertook continuous missions across the course of the battle in the ways we described. But interestingly enough, the aerial interdiction in the Battle of Kursk was not really as effective as you might have thought. Let me see if I can find. What were we looking at here? They estimate that only 2.7% of the armored losses in Kursk that the Germans suffered were attributable to aerial attack.
Which is which is remarkable, but interestingly, probably comparable to, say, Goodwood or an Epsom on the other side. We come back to the massive inaccuracy of the weapons that they're dropping. You're dropping iron weapons, even if you've attached a rocket to the end of it, it's just going to go over there somewhere, not necessarily where you pointed it.
Yeah, and a lot of this was lightweight components, and the Germans were introducing heavier versions of tanks. Panthers were being fielded in large numbers. Elephants, the assault guns have been reinforced, and then the Russians were dropping, like say, comparatively lightweight ammunition. Although there was a new aerial anti-tank bomb being used for the first time at Kursk. It was basically a shaped charge bomb of about a 25 kilograms. It was fairly effective, but more so against things like armored cars, half tracks, trucks. So and although the aerial attack didn't really account for much in the way of heavy armored losses, you can't dismiss the effectiveness and the utility of the aerial attack and their collateral benefit. I mean, it wasn't tactically the intent because they were meant to destroy tanks, but they were really, really great at pinning down Germans, diminishing the effectiveness of the Panzer Grenadiers and the infantry that were following up behind the armored spearheads, taking out soft-skin vehicles, really making resupply problematic. It was making battlefield evacuations of wounded problematic. I mean, on the Russian front, and especially in this battle, there was no respect for the Red Cross. I mean, if you were if you were an adversary of either side, you were a fair target. It didn't matter, what your condition was. So, this ground attack was really effective in interdicting communications, resupply, logistics, and hampered the reinforcements and the effectiveness of the Germans to sustain their attacks. But I mean, there's a whole host of other reasons why Kursk was a failure for the Germans, and none of it's really attributable to the air campaign, though. So.
No.
Yeah.
But we as airplane guys, we like to think it does.
Yeah.
But this is the thing that my hobby horse really is. There's more than one way to knock out a tank. You don't necessarily have to brew it up. To remove its crew is a very polite way of saying killing its crew. Take its fuel away. Take the resupply. That's as effective as anything. And this level of interdiction on the scale that it was going in, just immediately
taking off a track, forcing them into a mud or a soft spot, right? Get it stuck in soft ground, and what do you do?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we're going to race ahead a little bit, because
yes,
I want to talk about your particular aircraft. But looking back now, the reputation of the aircraft, I think, especially in the last sort of 20 years as well, it's been reevaluated, and it's still seen as something quite remarkable, considering it's a metal box with wooden wings and a wooden tail.
Yeah, and like all human nature. I mean, the Shturmovik even had its detractors in Russia. There's certain revisionism. I came across a quote from clearly somebody who is no friend of Sergei Ilyushin, who said, "Wow, he failed at designing a flying tank, being charitable. They roughly created a flying light reconnaissance, light armored vehicle, right?" So, but the Shturmovik crews were very quick to defend it. I mean, a lot of them still had their lives, because of the protection and the design of that aircraft, So, well, like any aircraft and everyone who crewed it, the airplane you flew was the best plane that got fielded in the war, right? If it brought you home, it was the best.
So let's get very specific. I've called her the Pima IL-2 in my notes, but your aircraft has quite a story behind it, and her journey to Tucson goes quite round the houses. So why don't you tell us about her and how she is today?
Yeah. So we've got it full restored. It's been out on display for about 2 years now. It was a several-year project. It arrived here at the museum shortly before I did in the early 2000s, and again, it's one of these sort of weird serendipitous type of things. And I'll probably have to jump around in the narrative a little bit because it kind of unfolded in a haphazard fashion. In 2001, this woman walked into our front administrative office and asked to see one of the curators, and he came up and she said, "Oh, hey, my dad had a little aviation operation in California, and he passed away suddenly, and we've liquidated the company, and we've sold the Learjets and all the stuff. But in the back of the hangar was this junky old airplane that he was going to use as a project, and we don't know what it is. We don't know what to do with it." She goes, "I live in Tucson, and I thought of you guys here, and I wondered if you guys might want it for the museum, because honestly, we could use a little bit of a tax offset against the estate." And so she showed the pictures to our curator, and he looked at it and said, "Oh, yeah, we'll take that." I mean, he recognized that it was certainly significant, if not immediately what it was. He says, "Shall I go do the paperwork now for you, ma'am?" And she goes, "Oh, that would be wonderful. We're on the way to the accountant, so I can take that with us and we can put this all to bed." So he ran off and got the donation paperwork done. And a few weeks later, a group of people from here went out to California to collect the airplane, brought it back, and it was in the storage building when I got here, and in basically the condition as it was recovered from the lake. And we really had no idea where it came from. We knew the guy in California had purchased it in 1995, but we didn't know who he had purchased it from. And I've subsequently been able to sort of piece together the most likely person, one of whom is now actually a friend of mine. He lives up in Phoenix, and he's involved with the guys at Novosibirsk that fly their Shturmovik. He's one of their Western agents for finding aircraft, and the guys there helped us with our project a little bit. But he and his partner, a guy named Jeet Mahal, shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed, say between 1991 and 1994, were very enterprising in exporting war material. So of course at the time, people weren't being paid, weren't being fed. There was kind of a not really a strong connection to Russian and especially Soviet history, despite the consequences of the Second World War. So it was relatively straightforward to get these things out of Russia for comparatively little money, enterprise. We don't know how much they paid for our airplane, but we do know that it was recovered by the Russian Navy near Leningrad with the intent for it to be restored and put on display in the Naval Museum in Leningrad. And Soviet Union fell. It was languishing in one of the storage yards there. Our Western entrepreneurs procured the airplane, shipped it out to into Quebec via Lithuania, and sold it to this fellow in California in 1995. We ended up with it. We stared at it for 10 or 15 years, really unsure what to do with it. I mean, there's no drawings, there's no blueprints, there was nothing, there's no references other than like model kits and line drawings. And, the woodworking was going to be a challenge. So, we'd contemplated just putting it out on display as like an archaeological relic and just sort of leave it at that. Well, other things took precedent, and in about 2010, we had a National Geographic film crew out here doing a piece on naval archaeology, and in particular, they were here because we had a Fritz X German guided munition here, an anti-shipping bomb, and the story was particularly about the battleship Roma that was sunk by a Fritz X. So they were out here talking about a Fritz X, but they had actually brought along this rather eccentric and brilliant German aircraft enthusiast and craftsman. And what they did here in a restoration shop is they built a replica, basically a wooden replica of a Fritz X, and then took it out to California and dropped it from a B-25 onto a paper replica of the Roma in the desert at Borrego Springs to recreate. So in the course of them doing this here for several weeks, we got to know the German craftsman pretty well. And, we were showing him around, and, we took him up in the storage. He's like, "Oh my God, you have a Shturmovik." And I was like, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Oh, why haven't you done anything with it?" And I explained, "Well, we don't really have information or means to do it." And he goes, "Well, I can help you with that." So several years later, we got going. I secured some funds for it. We cleared some room in the restoration hangar and put it on the floor. And it kind of became my baby and our collections manager's baby. We became really kind of, the detective work and the archaeological work was as interesting as sort of the operational history of the airplane. And, so we got swung into it, and the fellows in Germany, we contracted to do the wood components for us because they'd done several before. And I mean, so credit to their skill. So we did a template of the back area where the gunner's ring and where the wooden back fuselage would slip in, because it goes in a little, 1/4-inch sleeved area that they riveted through and bolted through. And, we sent that off to him, and he went off to one of the museums in Czechoslovakia and, did some dimensional measurements and climbed over theirs. And 6 months later, got pictures. Okay, it's done. It's ready to go. Put it in the container, bring it over here. So we got it over here, and it fit like a glove. It slid. There might have been an 1/8 of an inch variation where we had to temper, and twaddle a few things. And then once we got that done, a few months later, he and his assistant came over, and they rebuilt the wooden wings for us here. And we tried to be as faithful as we could, but we made some concessions. But he did actually bring over an awful lot of Russian birch plywood that was the same as would have been used originally, and we supplemented with a little bit of stuff locally for wing spars and whatnot. But the wooden skin on the Shturmovik is really pretty thin. It's basically door case thickness, 3 or 4 millimeter 2-3 ply plywood over plywood ribs that are basically jigsaw cut, and then wrapped in doped linen and shrunk for strength and then painted. So it took us several years to do this, but over the course of the project, we had no idea of the identity of the airplane. There was no documentation of it. And while we were cleaning it, we were being careful to see what we could find. Of course, we're pulling out armloads of peat moss from the fuselage in the cockpit, and little freshwater clam shells and skeletons of minnows and buckets. We probably pulled out 200 pounds, 150 kilograms of peat from the from the airplane, but it was still covered in grease and oil from when it was shot down. And we started washing it and degreasing it and using simple greening it through, and so in this time frame, we'd gotten in touch. So this is back, say, 2015, 2014. Relationships between the West and Russia were actually pretty convivial. So it was relatively easy for us to get in contact with people. And we got in contact with a guy who was sort of a Russian battlefield archaeologist and aircraft recovery guy, and he was a big fan of the Shturmovik, and we sent him pictures, and he said, "Oh yeah, well I can get you digital plans. I've been helping Boris and the guys at Vadim, and I can sell you the plans." So we bought the blueprints and as much material as we could from him, and got swung into action. And he says, "Do you know what the airplane is?" I said, "Well, no." He says, "Oh, okay, well, look for numbers." So we found numbers here and there, and we'd send them off to him, and he'd go, "Nope, nope, nope, nope." So one day we're cleaning, and we're fussing around, and on the upper aluminum cowl, stamped in sort of 1/4-inch high letters, was the number 5612. Well, then we started finding 5612 handwritten paint on various things, on the cowls and here and there, and inside the landing gear leg, and scratched on the aft firewall. And so we sent, "Well, does 5612 mean anything to you?" And he goes, "You've discovered the identity." 5 minutes later, we get this email from him with everything they know about the airplane. So they knew what the airplane was all along. They were just teasing it out of us, forcing us to discover what it was. They weren't about to make it easy for us. So suddenly we got this avalanche of information. We got pictures of the Russian recovery from the lake. We documentation on the crew, some of their battle citations, the unit it was assigned to. So overnight, we magically learned that it was a fairly rare version. So it was a naval Shturmovik, and it was in the Leningrad pocket, and it was with the 7th Guards Assault Aviation Regiment of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. So its regular crew, best we can, well, at least the guys that were in it when it was shot down, was Junior Lieutenant Andarilov Mark and his gunner sailor Leonid Grishnin. And they were shot down in this airplane on January 28th, 1944. And that's an important date because that's the day after the siege of Leningrad was lifted. This airplane was in the Leningrad pocket. So we subsequently learned that it had left probably Factory 30 in February 1943, went into the Leningrad pocket and was operational there for very close to a year. And when you look at the operational tempo of this unit, so this 7th Guards Assault Aviation Regiment, during its time in the Leningrad pocket, flew 17,000 sorties. And it was a mixed unit of Shturmoviks, PE-2s, lighter weight stuff. And they had a mixed role of anti-shipping missions in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic against the Germans, as well as interdiction behind German lines, trying to help lift the siege. They would do a lot of anti-artillery work, so they would work with artillery spotters on the ground. They'd get vectored in on German gun emplacements, and they'd blast them and move on. So this airplane, it's kind of remarkable, its career. And I'm gonna, my personal feeling is that of all the surviving World War II aircraft, this probably has the most combat time. So combat time becomes a very sort of important thing for Western aircraft enthusiasts. So, but given that these airfields were never more than 8 or 10 miles from the front lines, and the Russian operational tempo was basically, if it could fly, it fought, right? So it wouldn't necessarily be the same crew, but if the airplane was serviceable, you'd rearm, regroup, launch the airplane easily a couple times a day. Bad weather might keep it down, but nice weather in the winter, you could conceivably be up 10, 11 sorties in a day. So just sort of rolling into a ball of wax. Say, this was in with the unit for just shy of a year, 11 months. Let's knock off, say, 60 or 70 days for bad weather, maintenance, delivery, whatnot. So you're looking at 250 days of potential operational time. And let's just say, on average, this airplane might have done 3 sorties a day. You're getting to 750, 800, possibly more combat operations before it was lost. It's, the airplane is covered in battle damage. We were finding German 8mm rounds inside the cockpit. There was, anyway. So what happened is, the siege is broken, the Germans are retreating, the highway's open, and this unit is strafing Germans left, right, and center. Our airplane, while it was peeling off from attack, took ground fire and hit the belly, and it knocked out the oil pump on the back of the engine. So the airplane very quickly lost oil, seized up. They ditched the airplane on a little lake called Lake Bribo, which is just southeast of Leningrad. Probably a couple square miles, shallow lake, sort of typical prairie type of lake. And it sat on the ice there. When the ice melted in the spring, it went through to the bottom of the lake, and there it sat until the winter of 1992, when the Russian Navy recovered it and made its way over here. It's a remarkable survivor, and I'm really thrilled that we're able to give it a home. And tangentially, so you look at the airplane, some of its design stuff, the armored fuselage, the ground attack design, Ilyushin designed things like the wheel pants for the landing gear. The wheel sticks out. So if you've seen a DC-3, it's sort of half the wheels hanging below the nacelle. It's not fully retracted. Mm-hmm. Well, this was purposeful to aid in recoverability of aircraft if they ditched. So if they landed it, you wouldn't rip out the bottom of the airplane and the radiator, so you could theoretically recover the airplane, repair, and put it back into service. There was some experimentation with redundant elevator and rudder controls on the Shturmovik. So, in case of battle damage, you'd have, multiple sets of linkages. I mean, it didn't go very far, but several hundred were built with that. Literally across the street from my office is the spiritual home of the A-10 Warthog. They've been here since 1976. It's the main training base. Probably 20 or 30 flights a day go over my head. When you start looking at the design of the A-10 and you contrast it to the Shturmovik, you can see very clearly where the Fairchild engineers took wholesale concepts from Sergei Ilyushin's design and incorporated them into the A-10 and made it one of the most effective ground attack and aircraft in history. So, it's fun to have that here.
You have some fantastic neighbors, haven't you? Because you've got Davis Monahan just over the road, and then you've got the Boneyard. You've got a lot of toys around.
Oh yeah, we got the 162nd Air National Guard wing here with F-16s. There's it's again, when you talk about contrast, I mean, you and I both being Canadians, so the size of the Canadian Air Force. Well, the pararescue unit here has more Hercules in its unit than the entire Canadian Air Force does. So,
But before we start talking about that, because I think you guys did something really, really special when you rolled the aircraft out, because the IL-2 is most likely the most, as we were saying before, the most produced combat aircraft in history. So you paired it with a couple other aircraft, didn't you?
Yeah, we did. So we're unique and fortunate. We've got a Boeing 737-300 here. So the 737 is the most produced commercial aircraft in history so far. And the Cessna 172 is the most produced civil aircraft in history so far. So I think 48,000 copies of it and about 7,500 737. So when we rolled out the Shturmovik, we took the opportunity to bring all three of them together in a line and get a photograph of the 172, the Shturmovik, and the 737 all lined up in a row. So we had the unique opportunity to bring the three most produced commercial, military, and civil aircraft in history together for one family picture.
That's brilliant. It's a wonderful picture, and I'd urge everybody to have a quick Google of it, because it's three very, very different aircraft, but again, remarkable numbers of the lot, and only the 172 topping it really. So,
Yep.
I'm keen, because as I've got you, I'm going to ask you, because I made the silly mistake of on my day off when I was in Phoenix on business to play golf at TPC and not come down and visit you guys, which was stupid, especially when you see my scorecard for that day. Tell us a little bit about the museum, what you've got going on, and I'm going to geek out on some of your aircraft in a minute. But
oh, you bet. Yeah. So I'm proud to say that, without shame, I will make the assertion that we are probably easily one of the top 5 air and space technology museums on the planet.
Top 5's okay. Top 3 would be bragging.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna. We are probably the biggest that isn't a governmentally funded or supported museum, right? So the Smithsonian obviously has a huge collection. There's European collections that have huge numbers of aircraft, but we are the largest sort of privately. I hate to say privately, because it suggests that we have it made in terms of finance, because we don't. We're we're a small business like anybody other. We rely on gate traffic, special events, donations, gift shop sales, people buying lunch in the cafe. So we're sort of independently. We're the largest independent aviation museum in the world, and currently on display, we've got roughly 425 aircraft, probably another dozen or so back in storage or on the way, more in the pipeline. We've been incredibly fortunate. It's tapped into an innate ability that I have, where I can leverage all sorts of deal making, much like Radar O'Reilly and MASH, and results in all sorts of really interesting stuff coming our way. My wife complains that I'm fundamentally unable to do that with our personal finances, but you play to your strengths, right? So, but so it's been fun, because we're not restricted by any particular mandate, right? So like the RAF museum is focused on the history of the RAF, quite rightly so. Same with the Navy museums or various other service museums. We're the Hard Rock Cafe of airplanes. Love all, fly all. Right? If it flies, it fits, right? There's really no reason that if we don't have it and we have the opportunity to get it, that we can't do it, right? Obviously, we don't take everything that comes our way. We're not a Goodwill or a Salvation Army type of recycling shop, but we periodically turn down stuff. But largely speaking, if logistically we can manage it, we try to make the effort. So we run the gamut, and we've got probably the largest single point commercial airliner collection of anywhere. We have the most helicopters of any museum outside of a couple of dedicated vertical flight museums. We have the largest NASA aircraft collection. We have one of the few aerial firefighting collections around. And in the last 10 or 15 years, we've been able to go from having comparatively few operational and combat type World War II aircraft to having basically the complete set of American stuff, barring a Hellcat.
If anybody's listening, I now know a man who is in need of a Hellcat, so get in touch with Scott.
Yes, please do.
I was going through the list, and the list on the website is just it's a wonderful list, and I'm very jealous, and I'm regretting not coming to visit.
It's a lot of fun. I get to meet a lot of interesting people. I made a lot of really spectacular friends in the course of doing this. I've got great colleagues at other museums. It's it's been a wonderful life so far, and I'm really fortunate to have had the opportunity, and I've got great organizational support. I've got a board that believes in my vision and donors that support it, and I've got terrific staff and wonderful volunteers, and and a really eccentric community. I mean, what more could you want?
It's wonderful. Scott, I have to ask,
Hmm.
snakes.
Snakes.
How you got a lot of aircraft outside that
Yeah.
must make lovely homes, and I don't like snakes. So if
Hmm.
I'm going to come, I need to get the gen on this. What's the deal with snakes?
Well, no snakes on planes, but we have snakes under planes. It's a So yeah, well, I mean, I understand that, because it takes a little bit of adjusting. You certainly change your way of behavior when you move down to the desert. It's surprisingly lush and robust. There's lots of crazy stuff here, and I've encountered a lot of it, both at my home and here at work. But we do get rattlesnakes around, but fortunately, they tend to be nocturnal. If you're going to run into them, it's usually in the morning when we've run into them, and it's usually in the spring when they're coming out of their dormant period, and in the fall when they're feeding up before going dormant again. They're chasing heat. A couple of times in the well, a couple of times in the men's restroom here in my office building, we've come in there, and there's been a couple of fairly sizable rattlesnakes curled up in the corner. They end up against the wheels of the tires because they preserve the heat there. They'll get under the flap into the gift shop. So yeah, they definitely turn up, but our maintenance guys are pretty slick at we've got snake poles and buckets, and they're pretty quick at getting them and relocating them somewhere safe, because they're you don't want to get bitten by one, but they're great to have around because they keep the mice and the rodents down, and they're all part of our big happy family.
Big happy fan. Yeah. No, I'm glad you handled them well. So
Yeah.
how have you guys done through this rather ridiculous last year?
Yeah, well, like everybody else, COVID came on hard and fast and mercilessly. And we were closed completely for about 3 months. We've been back in limited operation since June of 2020, fortunately. Our community here in Tucson, responsibly managed COVID, not as good as some places, but better than a lot. But we saw a loss of about $2.5 million worth of revenue. I mean, it was not pretty. Fortunately, we were eligible for some federal support programs, and we had a couple donors that stepped up and kept us secure. But of course, we shed staff. We had to curtail operations, and we had to implement a lot of procedures to protect both our staff and guests and the general public, so we could keep doing what we're doing. And we've been able to ride our way through it fairly well. And as things are starting to relax a little bit over here, we're doing quite well. It's perverse, because people can't really leave the country effectively to do their overseas vacations. You know, they're stir crazy. They're stuck. There's a lot of domestic travel, and we're seeing about 40% of our traffic comes from California. So now that California loosened up in February, and it was basically going to no restrictions, I think in the next week or two, we're seeing huge influx of visitors from California and Texas and in the region. We're looking forward to having our foreign visitors back. We've had a really we have a really terrific fan base in the UK and in continental Europe, Australia, New Zealand, South America. A lot of very dedicated, passionate aviation enthusiasts. We're kind of a pilgrimage site. It's funny. The further away you go from Tucson, the bigger our brand and reputation gets. So it's all good, but it's worth the trip if you could make it. I mean, in all honesty, and it's not an expensive day, and we've got terrific people. You'll have a really fun time if you get a chance to come here.
I you I always say Pima is a bucket list place
Hmm.
to visit, and like I said, I stupidly
Yeah, we'll be here when you're ready to come, Matt.
Yeah. I shot 102 rounds Scott stealth. So
Yeah,
that's not
yeah,
nothing. I've now put that on a podcast. So
yeah.
it's stupid. I should have come and visited you. Great, Scott. This has been so much fun. It's great to hear that things are opening up in the museums, getting going the way it should be again. If anyone wants to find out any more about the museum and the work you're doing, where should they go?
We are on Facebook at Pima Air and Space Museum. There's the official site that has our logo on it. There's a couple of fan sites, so just watch where you click. Nothing wrong with clicking on both, but don't miss one for the other. Our website's www.pimaair.org. Our sister museum's TitanMissileMuseum.org, which is again fascinating thing. One of the only preserved Titan II ICBM silo complexes in the world. So lots to go. We got lots of exciting stuff in the pipeline for the coming years. Here we are. We're open 363 days a year, closed Thanksgiving and Christmas, but otherwise we're here for you.
And the sun's always shining.
It is. God.
Scott, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
In 2020, when the boss ladies, Alex and Alina, started History Hack, the world was very strange. And unfortunately, it looks like 2021 is going to be equally strange. We would love it if you're able to support the podcast in any way. It will allow us to keep up the regularity of the pods and also the great guests that we've been able to bring you over the last year. We exist on Patreon as History Hack and also on Podbean, our podcast host's own platform called Patreon. The reward tiers are being updated at the moment, so there's going to be some fantastic options for you to choose from. So if you're able to support us, that would be fantastic. So we thank you very much, and until the next time.